For 19 years, no one asked. Not when they passed by it, not when the wind moved through the trees, and not even when the silence felt wrong. Because sometimes, the most dangerous secrets are not hidden. They are simply ignored. There was a cabin, small, wooden, standing alone at the edge of a forest road. Locked, always locked, but not broken, not abandoned in the way most places are. No shattered windows, no collapsed roof, no signs of decay that time usually leaves behind. It didn't look forgotten. It looked untouched, as if someone had closed the door carefully and made sure no one would ever open it again. And yet, for 19 years, no one asked why. If you're drawn to dark mysteries, hidden truths, and stories people were never meant to uncover, subscribe to Shadows of History. Because this cabin was not just locked, it was left that way for a reason. The road that led to the cabin was not a main road. It wasn't even marked on most maps. A narrow stretch of dirt, barely wide enough for a single vehicle, cutting through a dense forest that seemed to grow thicker with every passing year. The trees leaned inward, their branches reaching across the path, forming a tunnel of shadows. Even during the day, the sunlight struggled to pass through, and at the end of that road, the cabin stood, still, silent, waiting. No one knew exactly when it had been built. Some said it had always been there. Others claimed it appeared suddenly, after a storm many years ago. But no one could confirm either story, because no one had ever looked closely enough. The people who lived nearby treated the cabin the same way they treated the road, as something that existed, but didn't need to be understood. They passed it, they saw it, and then, they moved on, because asking questions would mean stopping, and stopping would mean looking, and looking might mean finding something they didn't want to find. Children were told not to go near it, not with warnings, not with fear, just simple instructions. Stay away from that road. No explanation, no reason, and strangely, that made it more effective, because when fear is explained, it can be challenged, but when it is silent, it becomes something else, something heavier, something unquestioned. There were no stories, no confirmed events, no official records, no missing person reports tied to the cabin, nothing that suggested anything had ever happened there. And yet, everything about it felt wrong. The door was the first thing people noticed. Old wood, darkened with age, but intact, strong, and always closed. A thick metal lock held it in place. Not rusted, not broken, just there, as if it had been checked, maintained, protected. But by who? No one had ever seen anyone go near that cabin. No one had ever seen anyone leave it. And yet the lock remained. Year after year, unchanged. The windows were worse, covered from the inside, not with boards nailed from the outside, but sealed from within, as if whoever had been inside didn't want anyone looking in, or didn't want anything getting out. And that detail, that small, unsettling detail, was enough to make most people look away. Quickly, quietly, without thinking too much about it, because thinking about it raised questions, and questions led to possibilities, and possibilities led somewhere dangerous. Time passed, seasons changed, the forest grew thicker, the road became less visible, but the cabin remained exactly the same, untouched, unchanged, unopened, and still, no one asked. It became part of the landscape, something familiar, something constant, something that didn't need to be understood, because it had always been there, and it had never caused a problem, at least, not one that anyone was willing to admit. But silence is not the same as safety, and ignoring something does not mean it isn't real. It just means no one has looked closely enough yet, and that moment when someone finally decides to stop, to question, to open what has always been closed, is the moment everything changes. It happened without warning. No storm, no event, no reason that anyone could clearly point to. Just a decision, a simple one. A new family moved into the area. They weren't from nearby. They had no connection to the land, no history with the road, no understanding of the silence that surrounded the cabin. To them, it was just another structure. Old, strange, but nothing more. They noticed it the first time they drove past. Of course they did. It was impossible not to. A cabin in the middle of nowhere. Locked. Sealed. Untouched. It didn't belong. Who lives there? The child asked from the back seat. The parents exchanged a brief glance, then looked back at the road. No one, the father said. And that was the truth. At least, the version of the truth that everyone had accepted. The child leaned slightly toward the window, watching the cabin as they passed. Eyes focused. Curious, as children often are. Because children don't ignore things. They notice. They question. They look longer than they should. And sometimes, they see things that others choose not to. Then why is it locked? The child asked. No answer came immediately. Because it was a simple question. And simple questions are often the hardest to answer. Probably just an old place, the mother said softly. But her voice lacked certainty. Because even she felt it. That subtle discomfort. That quiet tension. That sense that something about the cabin wasn't normal. The car moved on. The cabin disappeared behind the trees. And for a moment, everything felt normal again. But that feeling didn't last. Because later that night, something changed. The forest was quiet. The kind of quiet that usually brings comfort. But this time, it felt different. The child was the first to notice. A sound. Faint. Almost impossible to hear. At first, it seemed like nothing. Just the wind. Or the trees. Or the natural sounds of the night. But then, it came again. Clear this time. More defined. A knock. Soft. Distant. But unmistakable. Knock. Pause. Knock. The child sat up slowly. Listening. Trying to understand what they were hearing. And where it was coming from. Because it didn't feel like it was outside. Not entirely. It felt closer. Like it was coming from somewhere that shouldn't be making any sound at all. The child looked toward the window. Toward the direction of the road. Toward the place where the cabin stood. Hidden behind trees. Locked. Untouched. For 19 years. And in that moment, for the first time in nearly 2 decades, someone didn't ignore it. Because this time, someone had heard it. And this time, someone was going to ask. The first night is always the quietest. Not because nothing happens, but because everything is still adjusting. New walls. New sounds. New silence. The family had only been in the house for a few hours. Boxes still unpacked. Furniture only half arranged. The kind of temporary disorder that comes with a new beginning. But something about this place didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like something that had already been waiting, watching, listening. And now, finally aware that someone had arrived, the child lay awake, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening. Because once you hear something unusual, you don't forget it. You wait for it. You expect it. And sometimes, you hear it again. Knock. The sound came softly, barely there, but clear enough. Not random. Not natural. A pattern. Slow. Deliberate. Knock. Pause. Knock. The child sat up again. Heart beating slightly faster now. Not out of fear. Not yet. But out of curiosity. The kind that pulls you closer. Even when something tells you to stay back. Did you hear that? The child whispered. From the next room, the parents remained silent. Either they hadn't heard it, or they had chosen not to respond. Because sometimes ignoring something feels easier than explaining it. The sound didn't come again. Not that night. But it didn't need to. Because once is enough. Once is all it takes. To plant the question. And questions don't disappear. They grow. The next morning felt normal. Almost too normal. Sunlight filled the house. Birds could be heard outside. The forest looked calm. Peaceful. Harmless. As if the night had been imagined. As if nothing had happened at all. But the child remembered. And children don't dismiss things as easily. Can we go see the cabin? The child asked over breakfast. The room went quiet. Not tense. Not immediately. Just still. The parents exchanged another glance. The same kind as before. Brief. Unspoken. We don't need to go there. The father said calmly. But why? The child insisted. There it was again. That simple question. The one no one had answered for 19 years. Why? And just like everyone before them, they didn't have a real answer. It's just an old place, the mother repeated. But it's locked, the child said. And no one lives there. Silence. Because now, the logic didn't make sense anymore. A locked place, with no one inside, for 19 years, and no explanation. The child leaned back slightly, thinking, processing, because curiosity doesn't stop when it's ignored. It becomes stronger, more focused, more determined, and that was the moment something shifted. Not in the house, not in the forest, but in the story itself. Because for the first time, someone wasn't accepting the silence. They were questioning it. Days passed. The family settled in slowly, unpacking, cleaning, adjusting to their new surroundings. But something stayed with them. That subtle discomfort, that quiet awareness, the feeling that they were not completely alone. It wasn't constant. It didn't overwhelm them, but it was there, in small moments, in quiet pauses, in the spaces between normal things. The father noticed it first, not the sound, but the feeling. He would step outside sometimes, stand near the edge of the property, and look toward the road, toward the direction of the cabin. He didn't know why. There was nothing to see. Just trees, shadows, stillness. And yet, he kept looking, as if expecting something, or waiting for something to move, to change, to reveal itself. The mother felt it differently. Inside the house, in the silence, in the way the air sometimes felt heavier. Without explanation, she would stop what she was doing, listen, focus, but hear nothing. And somehow, that made it worse, because silence can hide anything. The child, however, didn't feel fear. Not yet. Only curiosity. Stronger now than before, because the knocking had returned. Not every night, not at the same time, but enough. Enough to be real. Enough to be noticed. Knock. Pause. Knock. The child began to listen more carefully, trying to understand it, trying to locate it. And slowly, a realization began to form. It wasn't coming from the house. It wasn't inside. It was outside, distant, but not too far, coming from one direction, the same direction, every time. The cabin. One evening, the child stood by the window, looking out toward the trees. The light was fading, the forest growing darker, shadows stretching longer. And in that moment, for just a second, something felt different. Not seen, not clearly, but sensed. A presence, a shift, as if something inside that forest was no longer completely still. The child leaned closer to the glass, trying to focus, trying to see. But there was nothing, only darkness, only trees, only silence. And yet, the feeling remained. That something had moved. That something had noticed. That something was aware. That night, the knocking came again. Louder this time. Closer. Knock. Pause. Knock. The child didn't hesitate. Got out of bed. Walked quietly toward the parents' room. Listen, the child said. The parents froze. Because this time, they heard it too. Clear. Unmistakable. Not the wind. Not the trees. Not imagination. A sound. A deliberate sound. Coming from outside. They looked at each other. And for the first time, there was no explanation left. The father moved toward the window. Slowly. Carefully. As if expecting something to be there. But when he looked out, he saw nothing. Just darkness. Just trees. Just the same silent forest. But the sound had been real. They all heard it. And that changed everything. Because now, it wasn't just curiosity anymore. Now, it was a question that demanded an answer. The next day, the father made a decision. Simple. Direct. Unavoidable. We're going to take a look, he said. The mother hesitated. Only for a moment. Because deep down, she already knew. This wasn't something that could be ignored anymore. Not after what they had heard. Not after what they had felt. The child didn't speak. But the curiosity in their eyes was enough. Because for them, this was never about fear. It was about understanding. About finding the truth behind something that didn't make sense. And the cabin was the only place where that truth could exist. That afternoon, they walked toward the road. The narrow path. The one that led into the forest. The one no one had chosen to follow for 19 years. Step by step, the trees closed in around them. The light dimmed. The air grew cooler, heavier, as if the forest itself didn't want them there. But they kept moving, because turning back now would mean living with the question forever. And some questions are worse than the answers. The cabin appeared slowly through the trees, just as it always had, still, silent, unchanged, waiting. The door stood exactly as before, locked, unbroken, untouched. The windows remained sealed, the structure intact, as if time had simply stopped right there, at that place. For 19 years, the family stopped a few steps away. No one moved closer immediately, because now they felt it, that same weight, that same tension, that same unspoken warning, the kind that tells you, this is where you should stop. But they didn't, because something had already begun, something that couldn't be undone. The father stepped forward, slowly, carefully, reaching toward the door. His hand paused, just inches away from the lock, because in that moment, everything felt different. The air, the silence, the stillness, as if something inside was listening, waiting, aware. And then, from the other side of the door, a sound, soft, faint, but unmistakable. Knock. The father froze. The mother stepped back. The child stared at the door. And for the first time, the truth became impossible to ignore. Because the sound didn't come from outside. It came from inside. The cabin. The place that had been locked for 19 years. The place no one had entered. The place everyone had ignored. And now, something inside it was knocking, asking to be heard, asking to be opened. The father slowly looked at the lock again, then back at the door, then at his family, because now there was only one question left, and it was no longer simple. It was no longer safe. It was something far more dangerous. If the cabin had been locked for 19 years, then who was knocking from the inside? The sound came from inside, not outside, not from the forest, not from the wind, from behind the door. The father didn't move. Not immediately, because the mind does something strange. When it hears something impossible, it tries to explain it, to reshape it, to make it normal. But there was no normal explanation left. The cabin had been locked for 19 years. No one had entered. No one had left. And yet, something inside had just knocked. Knocked. The sound came again, softer this time, but closer, clearer, deliberate. The mother took a step back. Instinct. Fear. Something deeper than logic. Did you hear that? She whispered. The father didn't answer, because he didn't need to. They all heard it, and that changed everything. The child stepped forward slightly, not out of bravery, but curiosity, the kind that doesn't understand danger until it's too late. It's inside, the child said quietly. The words felt heavier than they should have, because saying it out loud made it real. The father looked at the lock again. Old metal. Cold. Still intact. Untouched. There were no signs of tampering. No scratches. No broken edges. No evidence that anyone had tried to open it or close it for 19 years. And yet, the sound had come from within. He reached into his pocket slowly, pulled out a small set of tools. Not meant for this. Not designed to break something like this open. But enough. Enough to try. Because at this point, there was no turning back. Not after what they had heard. Not after what they had felt. And most importantly, not after the question had been asked. Because once you ask the question, you have to face the answer. No matter what it is. The father stepped closer to the door. The air around it felt different. Colder. Still. As if the space itself was holding something inside. Something that had been waiting. Waiting for this exact moment. He placed his hand on the lock. And for a brief second, he hesitated. Because deep down, he already knew. Whatever was behind that door was not going to be simple. But hesitation doesn't stop truth. It only delays it. And truth has a way of forcing itself forward. He began working on the lock. Slowly. Carefully. Each movement precise. Measured. Controlled. The forest around them remained silent. No wind. No birds. Nothing. As if everything nearby was watching. Listening. Waiting. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed softly. Too loud for comfort. Too quiet for certainty. Minutes passed. Slow. Heavy. Every second stretching longer than it should. And then, a click. Small, sharp, final. The lock loosened. The father froze, his hand still resting against it, because that sound changed everything. It meant the barrier was gone. It meant the separation between outside and inside no longer existed. The mother stepped closer, just slightly. The child didn't move at all, eyes fixed on the door, waiting. The father removed the lock, slowly, carefully, almost as if trying not to disturb something. And then, he placed his hand on the door. The wood felt solid, cold, still, as if nothing had ever touched it. For 19 years, he pushed, gently at first. The door didn't move, not because it was stuck, but because something inside resisted, not physically, but in a way that couldn't be explained. He pushed again, harder this time, and slowly, the door opened. The sound it made was not loud, not dramatic, just a low, dragging creak, like something waking up after a very long time. The darkness inside was immediate, thick, heavy, not just the absence of light, but something deeper, something that felt occupied. The father stood still at the entrance, looking inside, trying to adjust his eyes, trying to understand what he was seeing. But there was nothing. At first, just blackness, just space, just silence. "Wait here," he said quietly. But no one moved, because no one wanted to be left alone. Not now. Not here. He reached into his bag, pulled out a small flashlight, clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness. Thin, weak, but enough. Enough to reveal something. The floor, wooden, dust-covered, undisturbed. The light moved slowly across the space. Walls, bare, still, no damage, no signs of struggle. No signs of movement, nothing. And that was worse, because after everything they had felt, after everything they had heard, nothing didn't make sense. The father stepped inside, slowly, carefully. The floor creaked beneath his weight, a single sound, echoing slightly. The mother followed, reluctantly. The child remained at the doorway, watching, listening, because even now, the curiosity hadn't faded. It had grown. The air inside the cabin felt different, thicker, harder to breathe. Not because there wasn't enough oxygen, but because something about it didn't feel right. The flashlight moved again, revealing more. A table, old, covered in dust. A chair, slightly angled, as if someone had stood up and never returned. But nothing else. No personal items, no clothing, no signs of life, no signs of death. Just absence. And that absence was too perfect, too clean, too deliberate. "It's empty," the mother whispered, but her voice lacked certainty, because deep down, she knew this wasn't empty. This was something else. The father stepped further in, scanning the room again, slower this time, more focused, because now, he wasn't just looking, he was searching for something that didn't belong, something hidden, something that explained the sound. Because the sound had been real. They all heard it. And something real leaves evidence. Always. The flashlight beam paused. Near the far wall. Something felt off. Not visible. Not obvious. But wrong. The father stepped closer. Slowly. Each step deliberate. Measured. Controlled. Until he stood just inches away from the wall. He reached out. Touched it. The surface felt solid. Cold. But something about it didn't match the rest of the cabin. The texture, the spacing, the alignment, subtle differences, easy to miss, unless you were looking for them. He pressed slightly. Nothing. Then harder. Still nothing. But the feeling remained that this part of the wall was not what it seemed. The child stepped inside, quietly, drawn closer, as if something inside the cabin was pulling them in. The flashlight flickered briefly, then steadied. And in that moment, the sound came again. Closer. Louder. Knock. Not from the door. Not from outside. From behind the wall. The mother gasped softly. The father stepped back instantly. The child froze. Because now, there was no doubt left. The sound wasn't in the cabin. It was inside something. Behind something. Hidden. Waiting. And for 19 years, It had stayed there, unheard, ignored, until now. The father looked at the wall again, then at the floor, then back at the wall, because suddenly, everything made sense. The emptiness, the silence, the lack of evidence. It wasn't because nothing had happened. It was because something had been hidden, deliberately, carefully, completely. He stepped forward again, raised his hand, and knocked on the wall. Once, the sound that came back was not solid, not like the rest. It was hollow, deep, echoing, and then, from the other side, something responded. Knock, the exact same rhythm, the exact same pause, as if something inside was answering. The child took a step back. The mother couldn't speak, and the father stood completely still, because now, there was only one truth left. Something was inside that wall. Something that had been there for 19 years. Something that had heard them. Something that was now trying to communicate. The father lowered his hand slowly, eyes fixed on the wall, mind racing, because opening the door had been one thing. But this was something else entirely. This meant the cabin wasn't the secret. The cabin was hiding the secret. And whatever was behind that wall had never left, had never disappeared, had never stopped waiting. The father took a slow breath and looked at his family, because now the decision was no longer simple. It was no longer about curiosity. It was about something far more dangerous, something far more final, because once that wall was opened, there would be no going back, no undoing what was found, no forgetting what was revealed. And the question was no longer what is inside. The question now was, should it have ever been opened at all? The sound didn't fade. It didn't echo. And it didn't disappear into silence. It stayed. Present. Alive. Knock. Pause. Knock. But this time, it wasn't coming from a wall anymore. It was deeper. Further inside. As if the space they had just opened was only the first layer. The father didn't move. Not because he couldn't, but because his body understood something before his mind did. This wasn't over. Not even close. The mother stepped back slowly, her breathing uneven now, because the truth had changed. This was no longer about something that had happened. This was about something that might still be happening. The child stood frozen, eyes locked on the darkness inside the hidden space. Because children don't analyze fear the same way adults do. They feel it. Pure. Direct. Unfiltered. And right now, that feeling was telling them something was wrong. Very wrong. The father raised the flashlight again, his hand slightly shaking now. Not out of weakness, but because the situation had crossed a line between curiosity and consequence. The beam of light moved forward, slowly, carefully, cutting through the darkness. But it didn't reach the end, because there was no visible end. The space extended further, beyond what they had expected, beyond what should have been possible. This wasn't just a hidden chamber. It was something more, something deeper, something that had been concealed intentionally. The father took a step forward, into the space. The wood beneath his feet creaked softly, echoing in a way that didn't feel natural, as if the sound traveled further than it should, as if the space itself was larger than the cabin above it. The mother grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered, but her voice lacked control, because part of her already knew. It was too late to stop. The father gently pulled away, not aggressively, just enough to move forward, because something inside him had changed. The need to understand had become stronger than the instinct to retreat. He moved deeper, the flashlight beam scanning the walls, the floor, the ceiling, and that was when he noticed it. The walls weren't uniform. They weren't part of the original structure. They had been added, layered, reinforced, as if someone had tried, not just to hide something, but to contain it. The scratches were still there, but now, they were different. Not just marks, not just lines counting time. Some were deeper, more aggressive, more desperate, as if whoever had made them had been trying to break through, trying to escape. The father stopped. The air felt colder here, sharper, harder to breathe. The kind of cold that doesn't come from temperature, but from absence, from emptiness, from something that has been left too long. The knocking came again. Closer now. Knock. The sound didn't bounce. It didn't echo randomly. It came from a direction, a specific point. Further ahead, the father followed it, step by step, each movement slower than the last. Because now, he wasn't just searching. He was approaching something. Something that was aware. Something that was waiting. The mother stood at the entrance of the hidden space, unable to move forward, but unable to leave. Because leaving meant not knowing, and not knowing was no longer an option. The child remained silent, watching, listening, because sometimes silence reveals more than sound. The father reached the far end of the space, or what he thought was the end. But it wasn't a wall. Not exactly. It was another barrier, another layer. Wood, thicker, stronger, built differently, as if it had been added later, as if the first wall had not been enough. The father raised his hand slowly, placed it against the surface. Cold, solid, but familiar. The same feeling as before. The same unnatural stillness. The same sense that something was behind it. The knocking came again, directly from the other side. Knock. No delay. No echo. Immediate. Responsive. The father pulled his hand back instantly. Because this time, there was no doubt. Something was there. Not something that had been there. Something that still was. The paper in his other hand trembled slightly. The words echoing in his mind. If you can hear us, we are still here. The realization hit all at once. Not slowly. Not gradually. All at once. This wasn't a message from the past. It wasn't a memory. It wasn't an echo. It was current. Ongoing. Unfinished. The father stepped back. For the first time since entering the cabin. Because now, understanding had replaced curiosity. And understanding brought fear. Real fear. The kind that doesn't ask questions. The kind that demands distance. But distance wasn't possible anymore. Because they had already crossed the line. They had opened the door. They had broken the wall. They had entered the space. And now, something inside that space had responded. The mother called out softly, "Come back." But her voice felt distant, muted, as if the space itself was swallowing sound. The father didn't respond immediately. His eyes locked on the second barrier. Because now, there was only one thought left. One question. One decision. Should it be opened? Or should it be left alone? The knocking came again. Faster this time. Knock knock. Not patient anymore. Not waiting. Demanding. Urgent. As if whatever was inside knew exactly what was happening. Knew that someone had reached it. Knew that the barrier was all that remained. The child stepped back suddenly, as if reacting to something unseen. What if it's not asking to get out? The child said softly. The words froze the room. Because sometimes, the most terrifying possibility is not the obvious one. What if the knocking wasn't a request? What if it was a warning? The father's grip tightened, the tool still in his hand. Because now, there were two possibilities, both equally dangerous. Either something had been trapped and needed to be released, or something had been sealed and needed to stay that way. The difference between those two was everything, and they had no way of knowing which one was true. The knocking stopped. Suddenly. Completely. The silence that followed was heavier than anything before. Because now, there was no sound, no movement, no indication, only stillness. And that stillness felt intentional, as if whatever was behind that wall had made a choice. To stop, to wait, to let them decide. The father slowly lowered the tool, breathing uneven now, because for the first time, he wasn't sure what the right choice was. Open it, and risk something unimaginable, or walk away, and never know the truth. But some truths are not meant to be known, and some doors are not meant to be opened. The father took a step back, then another, until he stood beside his family again, all three of them staring at the darkness, at the hidden space, at the barrier beyond it. Because now, they understood something. This wasn't just a place. It was a decision, a moment, a line, and once crossed, nothing would ever be the same again. The father turned slowly, facing the exit, the light from the cabin faint but visible. A way out, a way back, to safety, to normal, to ignorance. But as they began to step away, a final sound came from behind them, soft, Faint, almost gentle. Knock. The three of them stopped, without turning around, because now, they didn't need to see it. They already knew. Something was still there, still waiting, still listening. And now, it knew. They had heard it. The question was no longer what was inside. The question was no longer who had been trapped. The question now was far more terrifying. If something was still there, then why had it waited 19 years? Until they arrived? Documentary narration script. Some doors are not locked to keep people out. They are locked to keep something in. For 19 years, that cabin stood in silence. Not abandoned, not forgotten, but avoided, ignored. Not because people didn't see it, but because deep down, they chose not to understand it. Because understanding comes with consequences, and questions lead to answers, and answers change everything. The family didn't know that. Not when they arrived, not when they heard the first knock, and not even when they stood in front of that door. Because to them, it was just a cabin, just a place, just another mystery waiting to be solved. But it wasn't. It was something far more dangerous, something that had already been decided, long before they ever came. The door was opened, the silence was broken, the wall was destroyed, and the truth was revealed, but not completely, because some truths don't show themselves all at once. They unfold, slowly, carefully, and sometimes they leave parts hidden, on purpose. The letter told a story of people trapped, left behind, ignored, a story of knocking, waiting, hoping that someone would hear them. But the most disturbing part wasn't what the letter said. It was what it implied, that the knocking never stopped, that the waiting never ended, that whatever had been placed inside that space had not disappeared with time. Because time doesn't erase everything. Some things remain, and when they do, they don't stay silent forever. The family walked away, but not unchanged. Because once you hear something like that, once you feel something like that, it doesn't leave you. It stays. In your thoughts. In your silence. In the moments when everything else is quiet. The cabin still stands. The door no longer locked. The first wall broken. The hidden space exposed. But the second barrier remains. Unopened. Untouched. And behind it, something still exists. Something that knocked. Something that responded. Something that waited. The question is no longer, what was hidden there? The question is, why was it hidden so carefully? Why were there layers? Why was it sealed? Again and again. Because one barrier wasn't enough. One wall wasn't enough. One lock wasn't enough. Someone, at some point, made sure that whatever was inside would never come out. And yet, it knocked. Not in anger. Not in chaos. But in rhythm. In patience, in awareness, as if it understood time, as if it understood silence, as if it knew that eventually someone would come, and that someone would listen, would question, would open, and maybe that was the plan all along. Because the most terrifying possibility isn't that something was trapped. It's that something allowed itself to be trapped, to wait, to remain hidden, until the right moment, until the right people, until the right time. And now, that time has passed. The question remains, unanswered, unfinished, hanging in silence. If the knocking was real, if the letter was true, if something was still there, then the final truth is this. They didn't just find the cabin. The cabin was waiting for them. And now, after 19 years of silence, after years of being ignored, after everything that was uncovered, there is only one question left. A question no one has dared to answer. A question that changes everything. If something was still inside, then what is it waiting for now?